June 1991, 62-year-old Gordon McAllister, known as Gord, and his 59-year-old wife, Jacqueline, known as Jackie, of Lindsay, Ontario, were embarking on a road trip across Canada. The elderly couple were taking a new motorhome and had plans to visit Jackie's relatives along the way. On June 27th, they were on the first leg of their trip, and they decided to stop at Blind River Rest Stop on Highway 17 near River Bend, Ontario, just 85 miles from the US-Canadian border. Gord would get out and do a precursory safety check and felt the area was pretty safe. It was quiet and nice and sat right next to the Mississauga River, which ran next to the picnic area. They were also the only people staying there. The couple would eventually settle in for the night and go to bed. Sometime that next morning, around 1 a.m., they would be awoken by a loud knocking. From the other side of the door, they heard a man stating he was a police officer and they had to move their camper. He would continue to knock before eventually asking them to be let inside. Unfortunately, Jackie would give in and open the door. The man would then enter wielding 2 guns. He would state, quote, "I'm going to rob you and then I'm going to kill you," end quote. The frightened couple would get all of their valuables, including their rings, jewelry, cash, and credit cards, and dump it into Jackie's purse and hand it over. Jackie would then beg for their lives, promising that they would not tell anyone. As she went to hand over her purse, she accidentally dropped it. She then picked it up and placed it next to him. The gunman then pointed one of the guns at her. She would begin to beg, but it did not matter. The cold-blooded killer shot her in the chest. She fell to the bed. Gord immediately jumped out of the camper and landed on the ground when the man fired at him. He would then roll up and under the camper. As the crazed gunman jumped down to find him, headlights would come up on the scene. A 29-year-old named Brian Major got out of his car to see what the commotion was about. When he saw the gunman approaching him, he immediately tried to get back into his car, but it was too late. The man shot him through the windshield. Gord lay still and prayed. Luckily, the gunman got into his van and fled the scene. Gord would jump back into his camper and drove out to the highway. He knew that Jackie had been horribly wounded. As he made his way out onto the road, he would then realize too he had been wounded, once in the back and once in the foot. His adrenaline had been carrying him prior to this. He was, however, able to flag down several motorists who went and called for help. However, Jackie's wounds proved fatal. Sadly, the couple was nearing their 39th wedding anniversary. Brian Major also tragically died at the scene. He was less than half an hour from home and left behind a wife and young son. The police immediately sprang into action. Tracking dogs were brought to the scene, and a helicopter flew overhead, searching the surrounding areas. Amazingly, they found not one trace of the killer. 5 days later, the local papers would publish a police sketch of the man based on Gord's description. After this, a witness came forward to speak to detectives. He revealed that a few minutes after 1 a.m., a blue, late model van peeled out of the rest area and headed straight towards his car. The driver was able to swerve out of the way at the last second. He said the van continued east towards Sudbury, Ontario. Using this lead, police would check out over 3,500 blue vans on both the US and Canadian side of the border. They came up with nothing. Gord would spend his remaining years of his life looking through hundreds of mugshots to no avail. He would also spend a large portion of those years under police protection. As investigators believed, there was a possibility that if the man had went to that extent to hide his identity, he might come back to kill the only person that could identify him, that being Gord. The description of the man was around 30 years old, 5'10" with a slight build, long stringy blonde hair with a receding hairline. He drove a blue or brown older model Chevy or General Motors van with white full-size mirrors and white mud flaps. Investigators believe the man fled to the US after the murders. 4 years after the murder, in June 1995, 48-year-old former police officer Ronald Glenn West was arrested and charged in relation to 5 violent robberies he committed in Sault Ste. Marie. He would plead guilty and serve 8 years. However, in August 1999, DNA would link him to the murders of 2 women in Toronto way back in 1970. Investigators believed West could have been responsible for the Blind River killings, as he only lived 12 miles away from where the murders took place. Furthermore, he owned a .22 caliber rifle and 20 gauge shotgun. His ex-wife would also tell detectives he owned a blue van and that the police sketch of the suspect looked a lot like her husband with a blonde wig. And of course, West had been a former police officer and identified himself as one at the scene. It's all circumstantial, and he was never charged. Sadly, Gord would pass away at the age of 83 in 2012, never knowing who killed Jackie. Jim Duckett had spent years in the military before finally moving back to Shelbyville, Kentucky to be close to his sister. Jim, who was once a crime scene investigator himself in Germany, now lived a quiet life. But on November 10th, 2008, that quiet existence would be turned upside down. Jim's sister Catherine would not hear from her brother that Sunday morning, and she immediately became suspicious, since they talked nearly every morning. So she called his church friends to see if he had made it into church. They all told her that Jim wasn't at the service, which again was odd. And you might be wondering why Catherine was so panicked over something that could be as innocent as missing church or just not hearing from the person yet. Well, there was a good reason. Jim had been acting strange in the months prior, and even told Catherine he planned to move soon. But the scariest part was Jim's home had just been burglarized a week and a half prior on Halloween. Thankfully, he was not hurt. He only lost some jewelry, but it now made her feel uneasy. And on this Sunday, Catherine just knew something was off. She would go to Jim's house and see his car was gone. She had the key to his home, but didn't feel right just walking in, because she didn't want her brother to think that she didn't trust him. So she would eventually just go back home, not really knowing what else to do. The next day though, when Catherine still had not heard from Jim, she decided to go back and go inside. Not knowing what she would find, she slowly made her way in and finally made it to his bathroom, and was shocked to see that blood was everywhere. She at first thought Jim had committed suicide, but then she saw that his hands were tied to the kitchen chair. Of course, she called the police, and detectives came in and confirmed what she already knew. He was dead. But even worse, he had been tortured. The scene was very gruesome. He had been stabbed multiple times after being bound to the chair. DNA was taken from the scene, and over 14 years later, the killer remains unapprehended. And it's pretty obvious that this wasn't random. The killer sought Jim out, and you may also remember I mentioned his truck was not in the driveway. Investigators would later find out that the killer had stolen his truck and his ATM card, and oddly, instead of going to any ATM machine, he drove all the way across town to use the ATM machine that Jim used. The ATM camera actually captured the person withdrawing the money, but it was just too distorted to make anything out. It was just terrible luck, really, because the ATM had some maintenance done recently, and the technician putting it back together put the camera lens on improperly, making the video too fuzzy. Jim's truck was eventually found though. It was hidden behind some office buildings just 5 miles from his home. Again, they took DNA and nothing came from it. Dozens of people have been interviewed, and they've ran down several leads, still coming up empty-handed. Jim's sister Catherine has never given up though. She has even worked on her own investigation, making FOIA requests, as well as some unexpected help when 2 podcasters, Daniel Bright and Josiah Ward, opened a series on the case. They have tried to talk with the state police, who declined their request. However, the 2 podcasters did note that Kentucky State Trooper Post 12, which is handling the investigation, is very short-staffed on detectives, which has complicated the now cold case. The podcast team also stated something else that kind of goes along with what Catherine's investigation has found, and that is that they believe the murder to be a retaliatory murder. Yet, they have not shared any details why. The podcasters themselves have stated their investigation has led them to be nervous for their own safety, and have kind of withheld on talking much more about the case for the moment. Of course, not all share the view that this was a retaliatory murder. Some have pointed out that the obvious theory was that it was simply whoever robbed him before. They could have came to get the money from his checking account, or possibly it could have been a burglary gone bad. But isn't torture a little overkill for that? That's what leads to the final theory. If you haven't noticed, this case is very similar to that of Al Kite's. And if you don't know that one, Al Kite was a man that lived alone in Colorado and was going to rent out an extra room to someone, but this someone ended up murdering him after spending hours torturing him. He would then steal his truck and went to the ATM. That's pretty similar, but both men were also bound, and in both cases, little evidence was left. There's actually a surprising amount of people now who believe that the two cases may be linked. Of course, law enforcement has remained tight-lipped. On November 2nd, 2020, 22-year-old Vanessa Ceja-Ramirez would go for a hike with her mom and friend in Midlothian, Illinois. The trio planned to go to Midlothian Meadows, which is a forest/nature preserve that had walking paths. About 20 minutes into this hike though, sometime around 4 p.m., Vanessa started to get tired and stated that she was going to turn around and walk back to the car. After Vanessa's mother and friend walked a little further, they too would turn around and head back. But strangely, when they arrived back at the car, Vanessa was not there. They would begin to look for her, but found nothing, and would call law enforcement, who in turn launched a massive search. Helicopters flew above, while dogs went over the area and found nothing. Investigators would next look at Vanessa's cell phone pings to see if maybe she had left the area, either voluntarily or involuntarily. They would actually discover that her cell had pinged off of two different locations, one at a nearby apartment complex about 2 miles away, and the second one at a school that was located within a mile. Investigators went to search both and found nothing. 2 days later, about 1 p.m., Vanessa's body was found on the preserve. She had been bound, beaten, sexually assaulted, and then strangled with a ligature, and finally set on fire. Strangely, her shoes were missing too. The spot where she had been located was an area known as a place where strangers would go to party and start fires. Adding to the mystery in all this is Vanessa had just uploaded a photo to Snapchat that had been taken on the trail before she was murdered. That Snapchat did have the location public. Even more bizarre, the area where Vanessa was located had allegedly already been searched by volunteers the day before, finding nothing, indicating that the suspect may have waited to go back and place the body there. The aggression in the murder too is a bit frightening. Vanessa's mother called it vicious, while the medical examiner was quoted as saying, "beyond gruesome." It appeared that someone had pulled her off the trail into the wooded area and then began to torture her, which seems insane since her mother was only a few minutes away. That's why the other clues in this case really complicate it, like the cell phone pings and the Snapchat upload. Did she upload a pic that a friend seen, and maybe that friend wasn't such a friend, and he was the responsible party? Or was this just some monster who had hidden in the woods, waiting on someone to walk by, and it just happened to be Vanessa? That doesn't seem as likely. Could it be that Vanessa had planned to meet this other person that day, and that's why she left her mother and friend? Or did she make it back to the car and ran into someone that she knew, or someone that convinced her to go back to that apartment? Or was she abducted and the phone was just discarded there? So many questions for such a sad case.